Gavin, who is not here today, and Christine. And some more people. I can talk slowly. You've got the schedule here. John will introduce the lab in just a short while, and then we will have the first presentation by Alice and Sara. And after that, we will go for a break, following with Luis and Magdalena, who will present their thesis, and at the end, Fabian and Johanna will present their. Welcome. Hi. There are seats in the middle, and we're forced into here. So before we start, I would just like to comment that we are streaming this event live on YouTube as well. And we are organizing this event together with Johannes by Science Park, which is the organization that's in this building. We are co-hosting this event. And we should also thank the organization at Chalmers Blended Learning for helping out with the streaming. Welcome. There are seats in the middle as well. Forcing you into So, John, welcome on the stage.
Thank you. So this is the 5th time we have this event, and 5 years back it was a real adventure. How this should be organized and run, and we started to plan it. Was it 7 years back? Yeah. So it's a long journey to create something like this, and what I will try to do here is to try to give you some ideas. Why do we have a challenge lab, and what was the idea with the challenge lab, and what do we think? Why do we think that this kind of activity is really important, and why is the skills and the abilities that the students have gained during the lab of value as we see it. So I will use about 15 minutes to do that. And I myself is a professor here at Chalmers, and at that time, when we started Challenge Lab, I was the vice president of Chalmers. So that was one reason why we were able to do that, because it's not easy to change the structure at university. Anyone who has been working at university will understand what I'm saying. But it goes all the way to United Nations, actually. It is about sustainable future. How on earth can we live together on this planet? That is the main topic. And of course, it's a huge one. And it is formalized in this Agenda 2030, which was launched, agreed on. Hey, seats in the middle there, if you can find. There's a camera in the middle, so
yeah.
Be careful.
That's right.
Yeah. So it was launched in September 2015, and it was a great number of head of governments meeting in New York. Never before had so many people on that level met on this globe, actually. And they agreed on this Agenda 2030 with the 17 sustainable development goals. And they felt an urgency in this. They felt that now we are really the last generation that really can turn this around. And it is a lot of different aspects that are urgent in this climate, but it's also poverty, it's also about migration, it's about so many aspects. And how to deal with that. And the momentum in the process was quite great, because one thing was that it was lifted up from the environmental ministry to the prime minister level. Another was that the process invited not only the politicians, but also business and academy and NGOs. It was a huge process behind this. So you really get the feeling when you're there that it is serious and it is for real. And the the interesting thing is that on this international level, you really feel the urgency. You really feel that this is for real. But then often it is some kind of vacuum on the national level, because they are not connected to the international level really, and they are maybe can you guide people in so maybe we can move one make room for. So there are some over there. You really feel that it is of great importance on international level, but on the national level, the national level is a little bit distance from the international level, but it's also distance from the reality. The silo structure is greatest. You can feel it on the national level, on the departments, the ministries, and agencies. But on the local level, you are in the problem. You feel the problem. In a transport system, you can not only think about the transport system as something that deals with transportation. It's also about social aspects, it's about climate. Everything is there, and you have to deal with it. But on the national level, you can look at the transport system as something that is only about security or emissions. So that is something that they often talk about, that international goals are important, but you have to work locally with. And this lab is about working locally. And working locally means often that you have to work together, because no one alone can solve the problem. No scientist can do it, no business can do it alone, or not. A municipality cannot do it alone. But all of them are important for develop the new transport systems that do not emit carbon dioxide, for example, and create less noise, and are better when it comes to social aspects. Everyone are important to deal with that. And how can you then work with that in a way that those different actors are willing to work together and willing to deal with really complex issues that are uncertain, that are new, that are maybe not fit in their business model. Maybe they cannot see that they can earn money on it directly. How can they be willing to test and work with that anyway? Probably that will be important. And the region that are best in doing that will be best off if they succeed. And that means that you need probably a different logic when you're working, because the old logic, the thing that you already do in every organization, you're used to, we know where to go. Then we can call it a charter trip. We have to, that is important that we continue to do that. But we also need to do some expedition, some adventure into the future, into the unknown. And that is a different logic. Because in the charter trip, you optimize, refine, and improve what you have. But in the adventure, you're experimenting, you're testing. And here, current structure, routines, budget frames provide you support for what you're doing. But in the adventure, they can hinder. That is a hinder for you to test it better. And here it's about goals, targets, steering, controlling, measuring, following up. You think you can control and plan the future. And here it's more about guiding principle, creating trust. So people feel autonomy, flexibility. It's about creating space for new initiatives. It's about reflection and learning, and not least from mistakes. Dare to make mistakes together. In order to do that, you need trust in the system. And that is another logic that is. And the organization is often in center here, and the leadership is often about decision making. But here it's more about putting the question in the center. How can we transform for example, the healthcare system in a way and formulate language. And which actors are that then important to bring into that discussion? And then it's about co-creating together. And the leadership is more about facilitation than decision making in this logic. And here is about problem solving and solution implementation. We are wired to solve problems and implement solutions. And here we try to stay in the question and create a desirable future, something new. But that is another logic. Here is about getting rid of something that you don't want. Here is about to creating something that you really want. So I don't say this that because that this is better than that, but I say it because I think this will be necessary if we want to challenge what we do already. If we want to turn into something sustainability, we also need this logic beside this. So we need to have this, but we have to create space for this. And the lab is very much learning leadership around this. And the students from the Challenge Lab are one of the most skilled in this country to do this now, actually. They don't understand that yet, but they will when they come out and meet other people. And it's about learning between those. So here is about creating a room for letting the results from this influence what the charter trip, correct the course. And here is about really connect to that, because it's very funny to be here. And often this kind of space means that you meet in a room and have post-it notes and you have really fun, and it means nothing because you are not connected to this. So the thing is to connect it and how to do that. And you will see a lot of examples, 3 examples today. In the Agenda 2030, you can find 3 keywords. Transformation, that I think is really important. Transformation, that is not enough just to adjust the current transport system. You have to see that something old has to go away and something new has to be created. It is transformation of system. That is something new. That is something different than adjusting. It's about integration into respect. One is about perspectives. You cannot work with the transport system at first, just look at carbon dioxide emission, and then 10 years later think about social aspects. You have to have that on board from the beginning. Otherwise, we'll end up with a transport system maybe only making really rich people able to drive in very fancy electric cars in the city, if you have not thought about it in the beginning. And universality. That means the solution has to be possible everywhere. It's one group. And in the Agenda 2030 text, it is written, leaving no one behind. And that is very much about universality. And in the lab, we are working with 3 kinds of leadership, you can say. One is a leadership for humanity, how to understand sustainability, what that really means. Another is how can we create a space for co-creation, working together, leadership leading together with others. How can we do that? How can we run a good dialogue? How can we get information? How can we create trust? How can we work together with others and work with their strength? And leading yourself. What are your values? What is driving you? And what are my strengths? And how can I react to them? So we are trying to work with those 3 levels of leadership. And they relate then to the keywords also. And transformation, I said, is about replacing something old with a new. And often what's hindering is not only the technology. It's not just to develop an electric car and it will transform the system. There is this resistance in many different aspects. For example, knowledge. If you're a really skilled diesel engineer at Volvo, maybe you don't really applaud that your department for development will be replaced with the department of development of electric cars. Of course, there is a resistance in infrastructure, market, laws and policies, and culture and norms. And to understand what can maybe be a hindrance and what can drive the change. So old system can be replaced with new system. And how can we understand the sustainable future as some kind of lighthouse guiding this transition? And the method we have been working with at Challenge Lab is backcasting. That means you start in the future. You don't start with solving the problem. You start with really understanding the question. What is important and what is needed? And you do that in all different dimensions of sustainability. And then you start to understand what is the future looking. What do we have today? And what is this distance between what we have and where we want to be? And that gap is then the driver for innovation. In that gap, we try to identify leverage points where we can bridge the gap, where a little force can have made a big impact. And the interesting thing here is that the students do that themselves. We just facilitate and provide. The students identify their own leverage points, identify their own question, and that is unique. And we spend a lot of time doing that. And a lot of the result from the student from Challenge Lab is in identifying leverage points, in the communication with stakeholders. So the result you will see presented as a result from master thesis is only one part of the result. A lot of the result is in the dialoguing with the stakeholders, creating the trust in society. And when identifying the leverage point in the different dimension here, we try to identify strategies to make them be realized. And when it comes to integration, it is about creating trust. Because if you have trust in the system, we also dare to make mistakes together, and we want to collaborate. And trust is built on trying to understand each other and spend time in listening, trying to observe what others are doing. That doesn't mean that you need to agree with others, but you need to try to understand their perspective and respect their perspective, because then you have a foundation for collaboration and creativity. What we often see in society is that we do not spend time enough to really try to understand others' perspective. That means there will be misunderstanding and lack of trust. And if there is a lack of trust, it will be a separation. And if there is a separation, there will be the same thing will be done in different places. It will be a redundancy in the system. And if that happens, there will be increased cost, decreased resources in internal competition. If you feel internal competition, you also feel fear. And fear separates even more. And that can happen within an organization or between organizations. So one very important role for the student is actually to create trust between stakeholders, to make this positive loop spin instead of this. And we have activity in the region trying to make academy and business and public sector to meet. And we have identified, and we saw results from yesterday, stakeholder telling that the Challenge Lab students have been essential for bringing academy, society, and industry together around a leverage point, a question that is important. And they have created a new kind of meeting that can be very important for the future. Challenge Lab can also be important for a university connecting research in innovation education. So that is the idea. And we really think that students have a unique role to play because almost everyone else in society has something written on the forehead. For me, it's charmers. And it works very well when I work with industry and when I work with the public sector. But when I try to convince Gothenburg University about something, they say, oh, he's from Chalmers, you know. So he has a vested interest in this. So even for me as a researcher, I have something on my forehead. And so it is for almost everyone. But for a student, it is no threat. And people open up and share information. And we have seen that happen so many times. So students have a very important role. They get access to information. And they create trust. So what we are doing, we have a course first preparing for this lab called Leadership for Sustainable Transition. And during the spring, we have this lab for master theses. We are also doing research, and we have trying to create a challenge lab in South Africa and Germany because they want us to do that, and that is very interesting because they're also in the same time zone as we are, so we can connect later maybe. And we also develop a Space for Change Institute, trying to maybe creating a platform for students from the Challenge Lab to do their first consultant work to different organizations because people do not really know what they are missing until they have met it. So you have to label it and convince people that this is important. And this is coming more and more. And we are planning to invite students from Gothenburg University to make it even broader next year. And we are also assisting other universities to create the labs. And we are also willing to share information and also collaborate and discuss. So just contact Andreas or me. And this is our motto. Think big, start small, act now. Do a lot of mistakes fast, so you can learn fast. That is challenging. Okay, so by that, over to the presentation.
Exactly. And it's Alice and Sara that get to start. So, John, thank you very much. Alice and Sara, the stage is yours. I told everyone yesterday, so I almost forgot today. The presentation is 25 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes. I'll let you know when 25 minutes have passed. And after the presentation is 10 minutes of opposition. And after those 10 minutes, we have 15 minutes for the audience to ask questions.
Thank you, John, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you to the people who I am aware are watching the live stream by YouTube as well. I'm Alice and this is Sara. Today we're going to be talking about biogas, which has been acknowledged by several of our stakeholders as not the sexiest of subjects. But if you hang in there, I hope by the end you will agree that it's quite an interesting and important thing, even if superficially it doesn't seem like the most fun. So in our study, we've been investigating the barriers and enablers for the biogas value chain in Västra Götaland to support the potential in identified. So in our presentation today, we're going to briefly introduce you to biogas and hopefully convince you that it is really great and give you a little insight into the approach that we took for our study. We're also going to present a case study of the current situation in Västra Götaland for biogas, and then we have some results and proposals based on the work that we've done. And finally, we'll share some conclusions as we have discussed with stakeholders. And at the very end of it, you will be rewarded with feedback.
Okay, so first of all, we need to explain to you why biogas is so awesome that we decided to base our entire thesis around it. And in order to do that, you first need to know what biogas actually is. And it's a gaseous mixture containing of methane and carbon dioxide. and it is produced through anaerobic digestion, which would be here in the diagram. And anaerobic digestion is a natural process that occurs when microorganisms, such as bacteria, break down organic material in an oxygen-free environment. And this organic material can be typical waste products, such as the ones listed here: livestock waste, agricultural residues, wastewater, and food waste. To be fair, it can also be you can also cultivate crops in order to do this process, but then it would be called energy crops, and it is not considered sustainable in the scope of our study. By doing this, you put value into waste, which is called waste valorization, where you turn waste into a resource. And from this process, you then get the biogas and then digest it, which is basically a fancy word for a byproduct, according to me. And this byproduct is quite nutrient rich, so it can be used as high quality fertilizer in organic farming. And it can both increase the protein content of the crops and the actual yield. So by using this in farming, you can create a nutrient circle where the fertilizer goes onto the lands and the arable lands, and you create products, agricultural products, which would also create more waste going into the digester and all the nutrients would again end up here. And there you have a circular loop, which is quite valuable, without even having mentioned the biogas, which I would now come to. The biogas in itself can be used either directly in heat and electricity when you combust it, or it can be upgraded, which means that you increase the methane content of the gas into biomethane, which is a viable vehicle fuel, and also can replace natural gas in the gas grids. And this would reduce greenhouse gas emissions in these sectors due to carbon offset from growing the crops, which the biogas is originated from. It would also reduce agricultural eutrophication and demineralization through the cycling. And lastly, it also prevents methane emissions from waste storage, because even if you wouldn't capture the biogas produced from this process will still occur, and then that methane would just be released into the atmosphere, and it's quite intense greenhouse gas. But in spite of all these benefits that has been identified, in 2007 it was estimated that only 10% of the potential of biogas production in Sweden was being utilized, and by 2015 this had only slightly increased to just under 14%. And in addition, Västra Götaland, this region has been identified as one of the regions with the most potential in the country. So at present there is a large amount of potential that is far from fulfilled. So even though biogas has the potential to play a key role in meeting both regional and national environmental targets, investigation needs to be carried out in order to understand what needs to be done to grasp these opportunities.
During the aim of this study, we acknowledge that there is identified potential within this region, and we wanted to understand what the barriers were from fulfilling this potential and what enablers could help the potential be reached. And the scope was that we wanted it had to focus on this region, and we also wanted sustainable production. So as Sara mentioned earlier, it should be from waste materials rather than energy crops. And we identified a main research question of what are the barriers hindering biogas from being used to its full potential within the current socio-technical regime in Västra Götaland, and what enablers could help reach this potential. And that was a bit of a mouthful, so we broke it down into three easier to tackle questions, which were to look into the current situation and identify what the potential was for further development, and then identify the main barriers, and then finally to find what changes we felt would help support the development in the region. So as John talked about earlier, at the very start of this process we did backcasting, and Sara and I both were randomly very interested in waste and waste valorization, and we thought that biogas would be a really interesting way to look into this. And then throughout the rest of the study, we used literature studies quite a lot to support everything we were doing. But firstly, we did a case study on the current value chain. Then we identified some stakeholders and conducted semi-structured interviews with them, from which we got a lot of data, which we analysed using open coding, which is where you kind of break everything you found into separate statements, and then grounded theory to sort of group that a bit more into themes, and then a SWOT analysis to separate it into more themes of strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats. Thematic categorization, again, just to sort of make it more manageable data, and then finally we prioritized it to find a focus for the study. And then we conducted some more focused research with comparisons and follow-up questions. And Sara will now go through the case study.
Yeah, so this is the overview of the value chain that we created. And the red parts are private actors, and the blue ones are municipal actors, first of all. And as can be seen from the top of the screen, we simplified it by looking into feedstock, upstream logistics, production, transformation, downstream logistics, and products separately. And then we also included supporting public organization at the bottom, spanning over all of the categories, because these actors have the ability to influence all parts of the value chain. Early on in our research, we found a great example of this in the network Biogas West, that is an elaborate network within the region that consists of actors working together to promote biogas development in this region. So that was really helpful for us moving forward as well. When we speak about feedstocks, we mean the raw material that goes into the production. And in this region, these are usually agricultural waste or industrial waste, when speaking of privately owned actors, or municipal waste and sewage sludge, when it's municipal actors. And at present, municipal waste is the predominant feedstock used. But there is a very strong agricultural and forestry sector within this region. And so Västra Götaland has the feedstock capacity to fulfill 60% of the 20 terawatt-hour biofuel demand in Sweden forecasted by 2030. When we speak about upstream logistics, we talk about when the raw material is transported from the waste producers to the production facility. And as we didn't choose a specific site for our study, we couldn't really look into this in detail. But we do want to know that this distance is quite important to keep at a minimum, so you don't lose the environmental benefit gained from the biogas through the environmental impact that is a result of the transport. So you should aim to produce biogas locally and from organic waste. Production refers to the production facilities where this anaerobic digestance takes place. And Västra Götaland is actually the second biggest producer in Sweden and houses 45 facilities. It was having 45 facilities in 2016. And then Västra Götaland produced 60% of Swedish biogas. The total was 2 terawatt hours, and Västra Götaland produced 327 gigawatt hours. But this is actually a 7% decrease in regional production from the previous year. Nonetheless, there are some very ambitious targets set in the region, and actually the aim is to, by 2020, produce 2.4 terawatt hours annually in the region. And as you can see, in 2 years this would be quite unachievable, considering that the national production is lower than what is the goal for Västra Götaland and the small amount of biogas produced today. However, the 2.4 terawatt hours is actually calculated on the potential in the region, so it's not by any means unachievable, just not within this time frame. When we speak about transformation, we speak about upgrading biogas into higher quality, liquefying it to liquid biogas, or using it for combined heat and power, which is CHP in the presentation. Combined heat and power is often considered to be the most efficient use for small-scale producers, that is farmers, basically, and particularly if they have heating and electricity needs on site. But when speaking of large-scale production, Västra Götaland. What happened? Oh, you have a warning.
Same update as just.
Västra Götaland actually has a lot of potential. There we are, as it has the most biogas upgraded facilities of any region in Sweden. There are 12 facilities within Västra Götaland. When we speak about downstream logistics, it's transportation from the upgraded biogas products to the end user or the end consumer. And when you transport liquid biogas, this is often done by truck. But for the upgraded biogas, this can be injected to the natural gas grid that we have on the west coast, running from Stenungsund through Gothenburg down to Malmö, then over to Denmark. And there was a 13% decrease in Västra Götaland indirect injections to the grid between 2015 and 16. And Västra Götaland is one of the only two regions in Sweden with a direct natural gas pipeline, which then connects Denmark. And we only have 2 of 13 injection points in this region. And another aspect of this that we couldn't really include in the value chain, but it's important to mention, is that it's the imported biogas from Denmark. This is done through this grid, which essentially also connects to Europe. And this, as there is a lot of import of Danish biogas, this conflicts with the aim to produce biogas locally and sustainably. And it also increases energy demand and with a longer transport, which reduces the overall efficiency. Also, this has had a severe impact on the economic conditions of producers here. The products are the point of application by different users. And these users span from individuals using biogas-fueled vehicles to the industrial scale manufacturers of those vehicles. We have also included farmers, as they may be in need of organic fertilizer. However, vehicle fuel is the predominant use of biogas in Västra Götaland. This case study enabled us to identify some relevant primary, secondary, and public stakeholders in the value chain of this region. And the primary stakeholders were involved in either the production or the use part of the value chain. The secondary were into research or lobbying, and the public are the ones who provide support to other actors. And in total, we interviewed 12 stakeholders, and we tried to choose these to represent all of the perspectives that would be in the value chain. Unfortunately, we couldn't get in contact with any small-scale waste producers, such as farmers, but we hope that their perspectives was, to some extent, covered by some of the public stakeholders that we interviewed that actually had a direct contact with these kinds of stakeholders. So finally, we have interviewed 3 primary producers, 2 primary consumers, 6 public actors, and 1 secondary, which is kind of external to the value chain. But Alex will tell you more about that.
I now realise that I forgot to mention earlier. So in a value chain, the idea is that you're trying to make the consumer perceive value in the product, which means that if you're looking at sustainable products or sort of alternatives to fossil fuels like biogas, it's a really good way to look at the market, because it means that you're placing value on all aspects of the product. So it's not just the profit potential. You can look at the sustainability and ethical aspects as well, which was why we've been talking about a value chain.
Do you want to tick off the research?
Oh yeah, I can also tick off the research question that I forgot. So as Sara said, we interviewed 12 very interesting stakeholders, which resulted in a very substantial amount of data, which we then split down into 198 separate statements, some of which were said by more than one stakeholder. So then to sort of narrow it down a bit more, we considered only the statements that were given by at least 2 stakeholders, which then still left us with 55. And then we wanted to find the top 3. And interestingly, as I sort of briefly mentioned earlier, we did a SWOT analysis, and the top 3 that we found were all threats, which I think strengthens the fact that the barriers are probably the biggest issue in the value chain in Västra Götaland. So inconsistency in supply and demand was the biggest perceived threat, but a lack of long-term agreements and planning was also an issue. And the lower cost of biogas imported from Denmark was mentioned quite a few times. In the top three, technically, we should have had that biogas enables circular economy as well. However, we felt that it was a sort of a supporting statement, but it was quite difficult to take concrete actions based on that. But we felt in terms of sort of persuading and pursuing drivers for tackling the threats, that would be quite a useful thing. And the thing that we felt was the best focus for the rest of the study at this stage was to look at policy, which is even more exciting than biogas. I'm sure you're all absolutely thrilled that this is where it led to. So the first thing we did was to look at different biogas policies in Europe, because we wanted to assess what the policies were here. We also identified that Denmark, we really needed to look at the Danish policies because that was where the direct competition was. But it would be quite interesting to see how different policies had worked in different countries, just to sort of cherry pick things that might be good ideas. And so that's what we did. Sara will talk a bit about Sweden and Denmark.
Yes, we started out by looking at the current policy schemes in Sweden and the current ones in Denmark in order to understand where this imbalance is coming from that we've heard of, so that we knew this moving forward. We categorized the policies depending on what part of the value chain they aimed at into production, distribution, use, and other. And there was a lot of data, but what is interesting about this are actually these three, or the lack of this one really. There is no distribution support in Sweden, and you don't separate the biogas from the natural gas when injecting it. So it's not prioritized to inject biogas. But in Denmark, there is support for actors upgrading and injecting into the grid, and there's also support for actors using with the end. It's production support for biogas producers where the end use is vehicle fuel. And then in Sweden, we have several kinds of support aimed at using biogas as vehicle fuel. So what happens is that the Danish biogas gets subsidized twice in the country of origin, and then it gets exported to Sweden and enjoys another subsidy here, which of course makes this biogas a lot cheaper than the Swedish one.
So the map here shows the different countries that we considered. There were 15 in total. I won't go into great amounts of detail, but it was so feed-in tariffs are basically where you get a fixed sum of money for either directly injecting biogas to the grid or for producing electricity from biogas and then feeding that into the electric grid. And this is really common in Europe. So 12 out of the 15 countries that we looked at had this. But Sweden was not one of those countries. And in a lot of countries, most notably Germany, the natural gas grid operator is financially responsible for installing the connection point to the grid if you are doing that. And it's not uncommon for them to then be completely responsible for that point from that point onwards. So they need to check the quality of the gas and make sure it's at the right pressure and maintain it. It was also interesting because in all the countries where economic support of some kind had been introduced, there was pretty much immediate effect of more biogas plants being built. But then as soon as you took that away, the development completely stopped, which is an interesting thing to observe. And finally, subsidies for biogas-fueled vehicles consistently result in more people buying biogas-fueled vehicles.
So based on these, we made a proposal of different schemes that could be worth implementing here. Speaking of producer support, it was shown in this investigation that feed-in tariffs for direct injection of biogas to the grid has been advantageous in the past. And in this case, there could be a guarantee of this feed-in tariffs for a minimum of 10 years, and it should be kept consistent. The tariff could also be scaled so that the small producers have greater incentives than the larger ones, and it should favor high reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. premium tariffs could be given to high production efficiency. On the distribution side, biogas producers and upgrading facilities should have access to the grid for connection. And to simplify this, you could introduce a certification system which would verify that the biogas has meets the standard to be injected to the grid. The cost of connection could be partially covered by the grid operation with a cap on what biogas producer can pay. And the grid operator could be responsible for constructing, operating, and maintaining this connection. We also concluded that the current financial support for biogas to vehicles should continue, as this has been shown to be successful, but that overall there should be better promotion of existing support. And these suggestions we then sent out to a selection of the stakeholders that we had interviewed, because we wanted to gain their feedback through follow-up in discussions, really. And again, these stakeholders were selected to represent all parts of the value chain, but it was a smaller selection than before.
So we used a very similar methodology to the analysis of the original interviews with the follow-up discussions. So in this diagram, the grey crosses represent statements given by one stakeholder. The yellow crosses are statements from two stakeholders, the green from three, and the blue are from all four. And we've got, so the primary producer, consumer, and public stakeholder were all interviewed in the original set of interviews, and also were all relevant actors within Västra Götaland. The secondary stakeholder we actually hadn't interviewed in the first round of interviews, but he was sort of, I would say, Sweden's leading expert on biogas. So he gave us a bit of an external perspective, and he's also outside the region, so his bubble is slightly separate from everybody else's. And so then if we go, so the most common, the thing that everybody agreed on was that the three main barriers that we'd identified were what they also saw as some of the key barriers to biogas development. And then the second most reported statement was that the grid needs to be more accessible. And at this point, it was also identified that Swedegas has a bit of a monopoly, which has resulted in direct feed-ins becoming a lot more expensive, and there's just a lot in transparency. And finally, a couple of people felt that it wasn't actually the best thing to do to encourage the smaller plants to develop, because there were just a lot of issues with that, which is an interesting twist towards the end. But then if I can go back to see the Venn diagram as a whole, I think the thing that was the most interesting was that there was a lot of overlap between what the primary producer and the public stakeholders said. So there was obviously that really supported the idea that the Biogas Väst network works really well, and that that the region is supporting biogas producers and understands what they need. And it's also interesting to see that there's not so much agreement between the primary consumer and the primary producers, and the primary consumer and the public. And we think this is because the policies in place in Sweden at the moment are basically aimed at favouring consumers. So their perspective is slightly different, which again just raises that there is sort of an imbalance within the policies, which is probably also leading to a bit of instability in the market, which is probably why there isn't. And it was also encouraging that the secondary stakeholder sort of had very similar views to us and the stakeholders who we discussed in the follow-up.
Good. Then we can move on to the conclusions from the first part of the study, which is the basically the case study through the interviews and the analysis of those. And we could conclude that there is an existing network in the region that works quite well, and they work to promote biogas production and use. And this shows political will and engagement, but that the potential in the biogas value chain is still largely unfulfilled. The regional focus on circularity, however, was identified as a main enabler, and is considered that this could act as a driver that could support and encourage collaboration and transparency. Additionally, we identified three main barriers, and these were inconsistency in supply and demand, lack of long-term planning and agreements at a national level, we might add, and that the current economic conditions for biogas producers in Västra Götaland is making it impossible for them to compete with cheap Danish imports. And then we also concluded that policy changes are needed in order to balance the biogas markets between Västra Götaland and Denmark to allow biogas from Västra Götaland to become competitive, because in this region it is viable to import cheaper biogas from Denmark.
In terms of distribution, we concluded that it would be good to propose some sort of feed-in tariff, as is commonplace elsewhere, but that this could be quite controversial because there isn't a universal gas grid in Sweden, which means that essentially only biogas producers in Skåne and Västra Götaland could really benefit from this. So it's unclear how that would work really, and was not really in the scope of that study. And that the private monopoly on the natural gas grid is another barrier. But if it was suggested by stakeholders in the follow-up discussions that the natural gas grid could be forced to accept biogas and could maybe even be made to prioritise biogas or give some sort of discounts in terms of the carbon offset potential.
And then in terms of we identified some enablers to biogas production, and that was that there was a need for greater transparencies in the opportunities for grid connection, and also that there is a need for transparency in the types of fundings available for biogas investments and projects, but also the eligibility of these and how the application process works to receive them. And after the follow-up discussion, we also think that guaranteed funding based on greenhouse gas emission reduction potential could be an effective way to encourage sustainable production of biogas, both environmentally speaking and in terms of economic resource allocation. And this could also help promote biogas production at a suitable scale so that the environmental benefits are maximized. Ideally, by developing more larger scale plants, it will become possible to also fulfill the demands of larger consumers that are existing in the region, and thereby improve stability and market conditions.
Collaboration is something which has cropped up time and time again in all the Challenge Lab projects. And I think biogas is something that there is overall a lot of complexity and a lot of multi-actor collaborations, which we've identified needs to happen more at a regional and international level, if not just a regional level. And that would probably help with the competition for export.
And then lastly, our suggested further research. We think that investigation could be carried out into EU policies and their impact at a more localized level, as this could be influential over future development in the region. And we also think that investigations into the cost of the implication associated with this kind of policy proposals could be undertaken, because during the follow-up discussion, some stakeholders thought that the gains connected to biogas from the benefits could actually outweigh the costs, while others thought that a long-term financial incentive would not be an effective use of taxpayer money. And from a technological perspective, it is recommended to give more consideration to liquid biogas, as this is more accessible than biogas that has to be injected to the grid, and this could mitigate the limitations that producers have of being in geographical proximity to the grid.
So that concludes today's presentation from us. If you have any questions, we'll look at it.
30 minutes on the spot. Good. So now it's time for 10 minutes of opposition. Tia and Krishnik, you're welcome on the stage. And
so to begin, congratulations to a well-executed presentation. Just before I officially begin the opposition, I just want to say I'm honored to have been with you through the whole Challenge Lab process. Albeit a fairly new friendship, I'm very happy that we could, I could see you take on this research question and come to these good conclusions. I'm really excited. I know that you have spoken about publishing maybe an article. I think that's something you should really consider doing. And with that said, I do have some stuff. I'm gonna give you this whole report because I put some marks here and there on things that I saw that were missing or could be made different. But one thing that you made very clear in the beginning of this presentation was that you limited the research from energy crops. This was something that took me a while whilst reading the report, so that this was not included, that it was only focused on waste. That is something I would recommend maybe clarifying for the reader. And with that said, I have a follow-up question, and it's that you interviewed a lot of stakeholders and you asked for their opinions, and they would say a set of enablers, which could be like that biogas could be an additional income for farmers, or that there were also other statements. I should have done this on the phone. But there were some statements, and I was just actually there they are, that biogas unites rural and urban communities. It enables circular economy and such. And a question to that would be, have you made any fact check on these statements?
Not really. I guess it comes up in the literature, and a common theme is that you can't really measure the social benefits, so it's difficult to address them. But at the same time, it is quite clear that agriculture tends to happen in rural areas and energy consumption tends to happen more in urban areas. So I guess that's the link there. And then for the enabling circular economy, I guess anything where you are making a loop and closing it would be the sector, which in this case would be a definite. And also, we would always need some sort of waste management. So this is a way to that need.
I can go now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also want to say thank you for the presentation, and thank you for a very thorough and informative report. And I was a bit intimidated first when I received it because it's very deep and a lot of information. But the more I read, the more interested I got in the topic. And I want to say that first I was very impressed by your data analysis methods. It was very many steps going through, and that impressed me. But even more, it appealed to me that you did this iterative process of getting to the recommendations, where you first made a literature review, and then spoke to the stakeholders, and then again made a literature review, and then again spoke to the stakeholders, and that I found really adding on to the context of the recommendations. But however, I found it a bit, when reading the report, it was a bit hard to grasp this process at first. And sort of in your initial methods, you only included the two first steps, like the first case study and the first results from the first interviews. And I want to know, how did your research design come about? Was it changed during the process, or how? For it,
Short answer to that is yes. And I mean, we had a different research question going into the process. So in the middle of it, we sat down and we realized that wasn't viable anymore, and we needed to come up with something different. So we pivoted and created something else. And I guess that's also why the method is very iterative, going back and forth, because that's how it was. And in terms of the last case study, we wanted to be a bit separate from the actual method, because that was dependent on results from all of the methods that was before. Yeah, but it technically wasn't part of the original method, because we got a result from which we thought we needed to do something more to make a solid result. That's what we think.
And as a reader, it would have been nice to maybe have an overview of this whole process in the beginning, even though I know you had a picture, but maybe more explaining, so it would be easier to follow.
Thank you.
I actually enjoyed the way you conducted the research. I thought it was a very clear red line with the whole beginning with that first case study, which led to the second. And also want to highlight, I really enjoyed the illustrations. It's very easy for me as a reader to follow the process. But you had a lot of theories in the report, like grounded theory, SWOT, and such, and maybe a section for us who are not familiar with these theories could have been nice to have. But regardless, I thought it was a good report, and it made me actually interested in biogas. So I guess you achieved that. And one thing that I was interested into knowing more about is, how do you consider? Did you consider any other technologies that might compete with biogas? I know there were some mentions about electric vehicles, but that was mainly on buses. Have you had any thoughts about maybe carbon capture and storage? How that technology might compete with biogas?
We didn't actually encounter it during research, so we have to do a lot about it.
But I guess with biogas, the distinct advantage is that you get two different products that are useful in society, as well as just preventing anything. So yeah, I guess also that it's a technology which is already there and it's reasonably well developed. I think it will develop more, but the processing plants, people know how to work.
And several stakeholders also said that biogas has been resilient throughout the years, so it has been around for a while, and it will probably be around for much longer, largely due to what I mentioned earlier about the waste management aspect of it. Because no matter what we do with biogas, we need to circle our resources, and that is a very strong argument for biogas. So I think it will be fun. One. You mentioned that Swedegas has the monopoly on the gas grid in Sweden, and they were like maybe pictured as the bad guy in the report, like having high feed-in tariffs and so on. And I wonder, did you consider like interviewing them, or did you try to approach them?
That came up very late in the day, so two days before we handed in our first draft, we discovered the gas monopoly. So I think it will be something to look into more. I think we'd already covered quite a lot of ground and it was a bit much. But I think in terms of future studies, that would be something really interesting.
And it would be interesting to see their perspectives in relation to the ones that we've interviewed. It might not be the same.
Okay. Can I take the because there was one question I really was excited to ask, because I want to hear your reflection over it. In the report it was said that Västra Götaland was a special case because it had a grid connection to Denmark. And then in the report it was also mentioned that Stockholm and current Swedish policies appear to be effective in some parts of Sweden, as growth has been identified in Stockholm and Skåne. And then that Västra Götaland is a unique to Sweden, and it's a special case with different approaches needed. Have you reflected on how come, since Skåne also has a direct connection to the Danish grid, what does Skåne, can we learn something from Skåne, or why are these policies more effective in Skåne than in Västra Götaland?
The only thing we heard about it was that the agricultural activity was only stronger. So what I would get from that would be that maybe they will develop, because this policy from Denmark is quite new, relatively speaking. It hasn't been a problem for very long, and maybe just the development in Skåne was more equipped to deal with that at that stage. But I guess also the fact that we have strong chemicals is the region that will be interested in using biogas and also influence it, because I don't think that's the case before. I don't know.
Yeah, but again, I guess that's something that we didn't really investigate in a huge amount of detail, but we could probably look into.
Yeah. Thank you.
Do you have any final quick question?
No, not the quick.
Good. So thank you very much. So computer. I have to update it during the break. Thank you for the opposition. Now we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. So please, anyone who would like to start asking a question, just let me know. There's one question from Nikki.
Sorry, I'm heading behind the pole, but I can. First of all, really nice presentation. I was kind of bummed out when you kept saying that biogas is boring, so I was hoping for like a boring presentation, but it was really interesting. So really good job. And I think the policies part actually made it even more interesting, contrary to what you both had claimed before. But that brings me to my question. You did focus a lot on biogas, and I understand that that's your sort of research area. But I'm just curious if you also looked at like using policies to create value for other products that were also obtained, like for example, fertilizers and stuff like that. Are there any initiatives or thinking in that direction?
I don't think I saw anything, and we really read a lot about policies. And actually, interestingly, that isn't mentioned at all. I don't think in any of the countries that I looked at.
And I think it was a bit underrepresented in the interview as well, the fertilizer aspect. And I don't know why that is. And it doesn't seem to be a fork provided for using fertilizer or creating it, other than the fact that it's viable or eligible for organic farming. And I guess that would be the reason itself.
But I also guess that it would be good if there were policies supporting that, because there are targets in place for I think all food served within the region through hospitals and schools by 2030 should be organic. And a couple of stakeholders had mentioned that obtaining organic fertilizer is quite difficult. So I guess that's a leverage point there. So maybe policy would be a good way to.
It's also self-sufficiency, also the goal in the region. If the fertilizer could provide more food to us to be more independent, which is also what I'm just saying. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Thank you very much for a very nice presentation. You mentioned stakeholders, that you had difficulties in finding farmers wanting to answer your questions. Do you think because I think from your presentation they would be one part really to benefit from the system. So have you made any thoughts about or studies about why didn't they join your interviews, or why is that? Because I think they could be an important part.
I think mostly it's very difficult to get any contact details for anyone, because I guess if you're in like a smallish, an individual with a smallish business, you're maybe not as widely publicised as say large vehicle manufacturers and other anonymous organisations. Yes, I think it's mostly just it's very difficult to find somebody who you don't know if they're not quite a big company.
And also they're very, very busy.
Yeah.
I did get a contact with someone, and they said that they would contact us, but it never happened. So I guess they were just busy with their own. I mean, farmers have a lot to do. So yeah.
There was
Excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Considering John's introduction on how to build trust, understand different stakeholders, you've interviewed quite many different aspects. You haven't detailed, from what I could understand, misunderstandings or contrasting views from the different stakeholders. Could you elaborate if you found any things that the different actors could work on to improving that understanding and that trust like biogas?
I mean, one of our first reflections, even during doing the interviews, was that there was a lot of awareness on from each part of the value chain about the other parts of the value chain. But there was a lot of agreement actually, which we were a bit suspicious of at first because it made our results very clear. But I can't really think of any strong disagreement.
No, it was really interesting, and it was there was just sort of a lot of empathy, and even a lot of people would say this isn't a problem for me, it's not a problem for my organisation, but I appreciate that these people would be affected by this. So it was interesting that people brought up things that weren't an issue for them, but that they knew would affect somebody else. So that doesn't really help with the collaboration because I would say the collaboration seems to be pretty good as a whole.
That's good to know as well.
Yeah, especially at the regional level. And I guess that's largely due to Biogas that they had a job. What they did here was that there is a lack of ownership on a political level on who to make policies and decisions about this affect so many parts of society. So, but then again, you move up one level, so it's apart from the actual network.
Have you shared the results with the stakeholders, or were they interested in seeing the results? And if yes, has it affected them? Have they changed their mind in some way?
Almost everybody asked for the report, and there are quite a few stakeholders in the room today, and people who we asked for follow-up discussions already keen to participate. And there has been talk of some stakeholders wanted to share it in sort of larger national ways. I guess the results don't directly impact anybody because it's more high level than actions that you can take as an individual or an organisation. But I think there is potential with it. There's a lot of
What I understand is they also just appointed someone from the government to investigate basically this. Yeah. So I guess in that case, that could also be someone that would be interested in just to get the background of 100 pages.
Good. Any more thoughts, questions? The geography perspective from and the local patriot of me is asking, you said 2 regions have direct connection to this grid, Skåne and Västra Götaland. There's a big chunk of Holland in between. Are there no connections to the grid in Holland?
I don't know.
My Swedish geography is.
So I'm from Halmstad, which is in Holland. It's like, it's 160 kilometers or something like that. That's just, I know that gas pipeline goes through there.
Holland wasn't mentioned as a region, though.
No, it's a county. Leonardo.
Thank you for the work you've done. I think you've done a lot of work, and we had a lot of discussions with Sara as well on how to move forward and all the iterations and so on. I think that's also a very important aspect of your work, not just presenting the final result, but actually being able to do that journey and getting there. So I was wondering actually if you have any takes on that to share with the audience, because I think it actually is a very interesting aspect of master thesis in general. In your case, it was really an important aspect, I would say.
I guess one thing would be to be quite open to let it take you where it's heading, because I think in some parts we were quite reluctant to let go of what we had thought of. That's one thing. And I guess also just from what we talked to you a lot about as well, just knowing why you do steps and focusing about in that, because it makes the whole work so much easier to justify, and also a bit easier than for the reader to know why it does something. Add something?
No, I think it is just that, like, if there is some sort of random idea or opportunity, it is often worth looking into it. Yeah. Because, to be fair, our process, though it seemed quite iterative and planned, was largely quite random and lucky. And when we were disregarding things that clearly weren't working out, that helped it to move forward. But, yeah, just look into lots of things, I think.
It's a difficult question because I do feel like I learned a lot, but I can't really pinpoint exactly what it
Yeah,
was.
no, you don't need to give a definitive answer. It's just more a reflection on that work because it's important.
Do we have a final question? Otherwise, we can move to the coffee break.
One question. In the initial part where it was mentioned that trust was an important part here. And since there is a common understanding of many of the challenges here, there's also, from our own experience, we had a meeting just before this actually, about how to collaborate in order to overcome some of the obstacles here. Do you think that this region, or maybe Sweden at large, has some unique way of working with trust, a unique way of working with collaboration that you have come across here that we could also copy outside Sweden?
That is something external perspective. I think it's nice that there is the Biogas network. I think that's clearly done a lot of good. But I think, generally speaking, just the very flat hierarchy in most Swedish organisations probably makes quite a big difference, because it means that people who might not necessarily talk to each other in other cultures do have the opportunity to talk, and I guess that helps with trust building a lot. I'm not quite sure whether you can then just say the whole world needs flat hierarchies, become Swedish will work immediately, but I guess it's a longer term aspiration.
That was a good note to end on. I think. So thank you very much for this. Now we'll have 15 minutes of coffee break. There's coffee and tea around the corner, and there are